today.
Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
My questions to the Prime Minister. Is it not the case that the Prime Minister's series of disastrous captain's picks continue to completely paralyse this government?
The Prime Minister.
No. What sort of question is that? We don't have a caucus.
When members cease interjecting, the Prime Minister will be able to answer the question.
Captain Hastings. Captain Hastings.
Yet another piece of empty bombast. Yet another piece of empty bombast from a Leader of the Opposition who has no answers for the questions facing our country. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to make it absolutely crystal clear that every day this government is focused on jobs, growth
Member
and
for
community
Jagga.
And, Mr. Speaker,
Member for Rankin.
whether it's setting an environmentally strong and economically responsible emissions reduction target, whether it is spearheading a national mobilisation against the scourge of ice, whether it is ensuring that the boats stay stopped, whether it is ensuring a strong national security response to the challenges of our time, this government is getting on with the job. We are getting on with the job, and, Mr. Speaker, just for once, I say to members opposite, why not stop playing politics and actually engage in the big challenges facing our country?
I call the member for Dawson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is acting to protect jobs against extreme green lawfare whilst ensuring the highest environmental standards are maintained?
I call the Prime Minister.
Well, I do thank the member for Dawson for his question, and I can assure him that every single day this government is focused on jobs and growth. Every single day this government is trying to ensure that our country is open for business. And, Mr. Speaker, one thing that we need to be open to is investment. The right investment in our country, the right investment in the projects that will give our country the jobs that we need. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say that because of the good work of this government, particularly the Minister for the Environment, we now have, subject to the Water Act, a one-stop shop for environmental approval, substantially achieved. Thanks to the good work of this government, particularly the Minister for the Environment, we have halved the time taken for environmental approvals, the shortest on record times for environmental approvals, and we have given environmental approval to projects worth over $1 trillion. That's what this government is doing. This government is supporting investment and jobs, but I regret to say, Mr. Speaker, that some Green groups are doing their best to sabotage investment and jobs in our country. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me make it absolutely crystal clear. We want the highest environmental standards to apply to investment in Australia. We want the highest environmental standards to apply in new projects in Australia, but once those standards have been met, those projects must be allowed to proceed. Right. Now, Mr. Speaker, take the Carmichael mine, for instance. Let's take the Carmichael mine in central Queensland. This is a $20 billion investment. This, Mr. Speaker, is a project that will create 10,000 jobs. This, Mr. Speaker, is a project that will power up the lives of some 100 million Indians for 50 years. So it's good for jobs, it's good for global development, and, Mr. Speaker, it's good for the environment because Australian coal is of a higher quality than the alternative. But, Mr. Speaker, this mine is being legally sabotaged by Green activists running a strategic campaign against the coal industry and, in fact, against all large developments. So I can inform you, Mr. Speaker, that this government will repeal Section 487(2) of the EPBC Act, which gives activists the standing to sabotage decisions. We know, this government, where we stand on jobs. The question is, where does Labor stand on jobs?
The member for Watson.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Dyson Heydon, ACQC, yesterday confirmed he accepted an invitation to speak at an event knowing full well it was organised by the Liberal Party when he was Royal Commissioner. Don't Mr Heydon's own admissions show that this Royal Commission has been politicised from the start and Mr Heydon's commission should be withdrawn?
Member for Deakin will cease interjecting. I call the Prime Minister.
There's a lot of things about Bill.
Well, Mr Speaker, in response to the member's question, let me make 3 points. First of all, Dyson Heydon, ACQC, is a former judge of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, a former judge of the High Court of Australia, a judge who has served our country with the greatest distinction and with integrity. That's the first point I make. Members opposite should be careful about impugning the integrity of such a man. Second point I make is that the Royal Commission into union corruption is absolutely necessary, as the facts revealed at that Royal Commission have shown. And members opposite should be very careful running a protection racket on a union protection racket. Members opposite should be very careful trying to protect from public exposure their union mates who for too long have been ripping off honest workers to protect themselves. The third point I make is that there is a foreshadowed application before the Royal Commission, and the sorts of points which the Manager of Opposition Business wishes to make could well be made before the Royal Commission, and that is the place for them to be made, should anyone wish to do so.
Call the member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline how the government is working to create a strong and prosperous economy by acting against lawfare? What challenges does the government face in this important task?
I call the Treasurer.
I thank the honourable member for Flynn for that question. And there is no doubt that the recent federal court decision in relation to the Adani Carmichael mine is a setback for the reputational risk of Australia, but it's also a setback for potentially 10,000 new jobs, primarily in Queensland. 10,000 new jobs in Queensland. Of course, there has been a litany of challenges against a mine that in fact is going to power the lives of 100 million impoverished people in India. It represents $20 billion of investment in Australia, 10,000 new jobs in Australia, and they're real jobs for truck drivers, train drivers, electricians, engineers, mechanics, geoscientists, stretching from Cairns to Mackay, Brisbane and Perth, right across the country, and particularly in Gladstone. And these jobs are now absolutely threatened by the militancy of the Green movement led by the Mackay Conservation Society, the Mackay Conservation Group. The Mackay Conservation Group was the main legal challenger against the Adani Carmichael mine. The Mackay Conservation Group is located 600 kilometres from the mine. 600 kilometres from the mine, 10 hours drive from the mine. And they are represented by the New South Wales Environmental Defenders Office, which is located 13.5 hours from the mine. 13.5 hours from the mine. This is a test for the Labor Party. This is a test for the Labor Party. Are they more interested in the politics of the Green movement? Are they more interested in the preferences of the Green Party, or do they really care about the workers of Australia? Does the Labor Party care about the workers of Australia? It's only the coalition that is prepared to stand up for the workers, and nothing illustrates it better. Nothing illustrates it better than what's happening in relation to the Adani Carmichael mine. I tell you what, we are going to stand up for this investment, because fundamentally this is about lifting people out of poverty in another part of the world as a result of Australia's surplus of energy. It is about creating jobs here in Australia that are going to build our prosperity, and fundamentally it's about standing up to the bullies in the Green movement who want to see an end to prosperity.
Yes, the member for Watson.
The Treasurer referred to an amendment to the EPBC Act, which none of us have seen. Could he please table it?
No, there's no point of order. There's no point of order. I call the member for Gorton.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In an extraordinary statement yesterday, Dyson Heydon, ACQC, again failed to rule out addressing Liberal Party
Members
events
on my right
in the
cease
future.
interjecting.
Don't Mr Heydon's own admissions show that this Royal Commission has been politicised from the start, and Mr Heydon's commission should be withdrawn? Will the Prime Minister finally show some leadership and deal with his captain's pick for Royal Commissioner?
I call the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the leadership which this parliament should show is the leadership necessary to clean up the union movement. That's the leadership that would be nice to see a little bit of amongst members opposite. Why are members opposite trying to protect the rorts, the rackets and the rip-offs which have been so abundantly exposed before this Royal Commission? Why are members opposite standing in the way of ensuring that the same standards of conduct that are demanded of company directors are also demanded of union officials?
The member
Why
for
is
Watson
this
on
man engaging in a cover-up of bad behaviour?
Resume your seat. The member for Watson.
The Prime Minister's not even going close to being directly relevant to the question that was asked. Not even close.
I've got it, Minister for Defence. I've ruled on this. I've ruled on this in earlier points of order. The Prime Minister has remained precisely on the topic of the question. The Prime Minister's relevant. The member for Sydney is warned.
What we have seen, Mr Speaker, over the last few days is a squalid attempt by the opposition to smear a former High Court judge. A squalid attempt by the opposition, a sordid, squalid attempt by an opposition which should know better to try to defend the indefensible, which are the series of abuses which have been exposed at the Royal Commission, where union official after union official has been ripping off workers in order to help the union, in some cases ripping off workers in order to help secure a pre-selection, in order to help secure the numbers within the Labor Party. Now, I say to members opposite, it's about time that we had honest unionism in this country. That's what the Royal Commission is about. It's about ensuring that we do have honest unionism in this country. That's what the Registered Organisations Commission bill, yet again blocked by members opposite, that was about securing decent, honest unionism in this country. That's what the Australian Building and Construction Commission is all about. It's about securing the rule of law on construction sites, and again that was blocked by members opposite. And I say to members opposite, stop running a protection racket on a protection racket. Stop smearing a High Court judge and give the honest workers and the honest unionists of this country a fair go. We want them to have a fair go, and it's high time you did too.
I call the member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development. Will the Minister advise the House of action the government is taking to encourage new projects and job growth in Central Queensland, How does extreme green lawfare present an obstacle to this goal?
I call the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Capricornia for her question. As the member would be well aware, the downturn in the mining sector has cost jobs, substantial numbers of jobs in central Queensland. That's why it's so important for new projects to be given a go-ahead as quickly as possible. We need to find ways to smooth the approvals process so that we can actually get jobs being created again in central Queensland, building projects that will actually deliver for our nation in the long term. Of course there needs to be thorough and appropriate environmental consideration, but the way in which the process is drawn out week after week, month after month, year after year by frivolous legal actions that are not about the substance of the issue, but looking at legal technicalities to delay and delay. Now, this is not some kind of accidental or community-motivated process. The reality was that a prospectus was put out in November 2011 talking about an almost $1 million campaign to stop the Australian coal mining boom. So this is a deliberate strategy, and the strategy was circulated by Greenpeace, Coal Swarm and the Graham Wood Foundation. Mentioned through the document are well-known people like Drew Hotton from Shut the Gate, who's been involved in every protest I can remember since my childhood. The reality is that these people have got a deliberate strategy, raising substantial amounts of money to stop projects. And they actually outline in detail their intention to use legal processes to delay and delay until the proponents are eventually exhausted and walk away. They don't win the moral argument, they cost us the jobs, but all they're interested in is delaying and delaying. Now, after this recent case, which delays the Carmichael project yet again, the Queensland Labor Minister demanded that the Commonwealth take action to fix the EPBC Act to prevent this kind of delaying activity from continuing into the future. Now, the Queensland Government, of course, is having it both ways, because on the one hand they're funding the organisations that are running the protest. They've taken $400 million off infrastructure expenditure that was going to benefit this particular project. But on the other hand, the Minister in Queensland, in the state Labor government, knows that these circumstances in the EPBC Act have the potential to delay and prevent projects from proceeding right across the state. We're about creating jobs. We want these projects to proceed. This particular project will create something like $20 billion or more in royalties for the state and taxes to governments. But it will also create 10,000 jobs. 10,000 jobs that will be absolutely critical to the people of central Queensland.
I call the member for Gorton.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker.
Member for Gorton, resume your seat. Members on my right will cease interjecting. No, member for Gorton, resume your seat. Members on my right, including the Treasurer, will cease interjecting. I can't hear the question. Treasurer, I call the member for Gorton.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Given Dyson Heydon ACQC doesn't see an issue with agreeing to speak at a Liberal Party event, what does the Prime Minister say to Australians who think it's absurd for Mr Heydon to sit in judgment of whether he is fit to continue his commission? Will the Prime Minister finally show some leadership and deal with his captain's pick for Royal Commissioner?
I call the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, if people before a court or a tribunal believe that there is an issue with the presiding officer, there are standard procedures that they can use. I would suggest to the member who asked the question, he does have a few mates who have appeared before the Royal Commission, and he could suggest to his mates that if there is any problem with the Royal Commissioner, they should bring an application in the usual way. They should bring an application in the usual way, And the
Member
fact
for
that they
Watson.
have not brought an application in the usual way makes me think that members opposite are even more feral than the ACTU when it comes to protecting union privilege.
I call the member for Maranoa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Industry and Science. How will the government ensure that the Carmichael mine in my electorate of Maranoa and other major projects of this nature can go ahead and create jobs without extreme groups using lawfare to disrupt and delay them?
I call the Minister for Industry and Science.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Maranoa for his question, and can I congratulate him on the work he has done for the people of Maranoa for the last 25 years and wish him well in his retirement, which was announced a few weeks ago. He is a neighbour of mine and a good friend, and we've actually known each other for much longer than politics, back to when he was the chair of the Graziers Association, and I wish both he and his wife well. He knows, Mr Speaker, as I do, and everyone on this side of the House knows, that we need sustainable development of our mineral resources, including coal, to ensure that our economy continues to grow. The member for Maranoa also knows how important it is that Australia continues to have the most rigorous, evidence-based environmental process in the world. And, Mr Speaker, once coal and other resource projects meet these requirements, they should be able to proceed without being subjected to what is essentially legal sabotage. Now, Mr Speaker, we on this side are concerned that groups with a philosophical opposition to coal are determined to delay and disrupt every coal project via protracted litigation, regardless of the broader merits of the project. So regardless of how strong the environmental protections are compared to where the alternative coal comes, regardless of how clean the coal is compared to coal from other countries that will be burnt in its stead, regardless of the economic impact on the community and regardless of the jobs it brings Australians. Now, Mr Speaker, this is not restricted just to coal. It covers infrastructure projects. In fact, what this environmental group have highlighted in this report that the Deputy Prime Minister quoted is that they are opposed to any form of economic development, and I table the report. Mr Speaker, there is a strategy to destroy jobs, and it's about time the Labor Party stood up for the workers. We stand up for the workers. How about you guys stand up for the workers for a change? How about you remember that this project is not only a $20 billion investment.
The Minister resume his seat. The Minister resume his seat. The member for Charlton on a point of order.
Relevant. This question was about the legal tactics
There's
of
no
green
point of
groups.
order. Resume your seat. I call the Minister. Resume your seat. The member for Charlton is warned. The Minister will...
This question is about jobs and protecting the environment, and that's what we do on this side, unlike those on the other side who only want the votes from the Greens. They're more interested in the votes from the Greens than they are from their own workers. Mr Speaker, we know they don't like the mining industry because they introduced a carbon tax and a mining tax. We had to remove it.
Minister's time has expired. Member for Bass will cease interjecting. I call the member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In the past week, the Prime Minister has repeatedly defended Dyson Heydon ACQC by referring to comments made by Julian Burnside QC. Is the Prime Minister aware of comments made by Mr Burnside today that, and I quote, "It seems to me that an honourable person in his position would step down"? And again I quote, "I would say I was misrepresented because Mr Abbott seems to have used my comment in support of Dyson Heydon not standing down."
I call the Prime Minister.
Julian Birdside.
I call the Prime Minister.
Well, as the Shadow Attorney-General well knows, if people before a tribunal or a Royal Commission have an issue with the presiding officer, there are standard procedures that can be taken. Standard procedures that can be taken, and I suggest to the member who asked the question, he should suggest to
Prime
people...
Prime Minister, resume your seat. Prime Minister, before I... The member for Hunter, the member for Griffith resume his seat. The member for Hunter.
Speaker, in my almost 20 years in this place, I have rarely heard such a level of noise coming from the government benches while questions are being asked on this side. And I ask you to bring to order what is obviously an orchestrated campaign.
Member for Hunter will resume his seat. Those on my right will cease interjecting. Those on my right will... The member for Aston will cease interjecting. The Minister will cease interjecting. Before I call the next question, we have present in the gallery today the former member for Hasluck, Mr Stuart Henry. The member for Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I've got a real question about jobs and opportunity. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer advise the House how the free trade agreement with China— you might want to listen to this— will the Treasurer advise the House how the free trade agreement with China, one of our most important partners, will lead to more jobs and opportunity for all Australians?
I call the Treasurer.
Well, that's right. I thank the honourable member for Mitchell for the question about jobs, because that's exactly what the coalition is about, how we can create more jobs for everyday Australians. And we're doing it, and we're doing it. Last month alone, 38,000 new jobs were created in Australia. And on average, under the Labor Party, in the last 12 months they were in government, 3,600 jobs a month. So last month alone, Australia created more than 10 times the number of jobs that were created
the Treasurer will
under
resume
Labor.
his seat. The Treasury will resume his seat. The member for Bass is warned. The member for Rankin on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, to be relevant, the Treasurer has to refer to the 800,000 unemployed, the first time since 1994.
The member for Rankin, that is not a point of order. You've been warned. That is disorderly conduct. The member for Lawler is warned. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, forgive him. He worked for the worst Treasurer in Australian history, a man that oversaw 200,000 jobs go under Swanee. 200,000 jobs go under Swanee. He was the brain behind the member.
The Treasurer will.
Because
the
we
Treasurer
know there's a
resume his
vacuum.
seat. Treasurer resume his seat. The member for Griffith. This can't be on relevance. So, what is the point of order?
No point of order, Mr Speaker. The Treasurer is wrong. The member for Rankin never worked for Joe Hockey, the current Treasurer.
That is an abuse. The member for Griffith will leave under Standing Order 94A. I call the Treasurer. Member for Griffith will leave under 94A immediately.
I know she occupies Kevin Rudd's seat, and he was a great fan of the member for Lilly, obviously, we know that. In fact,
Member
the Shadow
for Griffith
Treasurer,
will leave immediately.
the Shadow Treasurer is also a great fan of the member for Lilly. I've just received his book called The Money Men. And when he refers to the member for Lilly, he said Swan remains on Labor's backbench,
it can only
mainly
be on
contributing to the national debate through tweets relating to Joe
I'm not
Hockey.
recognising him. There can only be a question on relevance. Has the Treasurer concluded his answer? The member for Isaacs.
Thank you.
Member for Isaacs might just resume his seat. You haven't concluded your answer?
Because I'm back to talking about jobs. And the reason why
Treasurer, resume your seat. This can't be a point of order on relevance. That one point of order has already been taken. You're on thin ice.
In the standing orders, you've already ruled on relevance, but he can't. This 91C actually. If you need some assistance, he's given direction.
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, we are defending the free trade agreement with China because that represents more jobs for Australians. The Labor Party is running a covert and at times overt campaign against more Australian jobs, jobs that would flow to businesses like Flavortech and Riverina, where they will see the tariffs on their manufactured food drop from 10% to 0. Fletcher International Exports, a meat exporter, will see 1,200 new jobs created as part of that business with the free trade agreement with China, or Rode Microphones, which will see the tariffs on their products reduced from 10% to 0, and they employ more than 200 people in the member for Reeds Electric. And the Labor Party is opposing the free trade agreement with China because they are at the beck and call of their union masters, the CFMEU. Well, now it is time on both the Adani Carmichael and the China Free Trade Agreement for the Labor Party to choose between their union mates or the workers.
Before I call the member for Isaacs, the member for Lyons is warned. Before I call the member for Isaacs, could I, on behalf of the House, welcome a Parliamentary Delegation Committee on National Defence and Security from Vietnam. The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister.
On my right will cease interjecting.
In the past
during
week, the Prime Minister has repeatedly defended Dyson Heydon ACQC by referring to comments made by Julian Burnside QC. Is the Prime Minister aware of comments made by Mr Burnside today that, and I quote, "It really was never a tenable possibility for him to appear to be impartial on the Royal Commission whilst being so closely associated with the Liberal Party as to accept that invitation"?
I call the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, while the government is interested in jobs and growth, all members opposite are interested in doing is smearing a former High Court judge. And frankly, for someone who rejoices in the title QC, to be engaged in this grubby exercise is beyond contempt.
The member for
really is
Jagga
beyond
has been
contempt.
warned.
Now, Mr Speaker, I've been asked
the member for
about
MacArthur
comments
is
today.
warned.
Well, let me give the QC opposite who asked the question a statement from Mr Duncan McConnell, President of the Law Council of Australia, who says, and I quote, "The public attacks on the Commissioner being played out through the media are unacceptable and damage the basis on which tribunals and courts operate." The President of the Law Council of Australia goes on, "The person who sits as a Royal Commissioner is entitled to the same respect inside and outside of the inquiry as a judge in a court. In this case, Mr John Dyson Heydon, ACQC, is a highly regarded former judicial officer. The proper way for dealing with any question of bias, including apprehended bias, is to make an application for the Commissioner to recuse himself." Why does the QC opposite not know that? Why does the QC opposite not respect that? Frankly, the QC opposite has demeaned himself. He has demeaned this parliament and he has demeaned his leader by asking that question.
I call the member for Wright.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the conflict in Syria and Iraq and the threats that it poses to our national security? And what is the government's response to this threat, and are there other approaches to the measures?
I call the Foreign Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Wright for this very serious question, because atrocities in Iraq and Syria continue unabated. 2 days ago, there were further reports that the terrorist organisation Daesh is using chemical weapons, this time mustard gas, in attacks on Kurdish forces in Syria. Now, systemic raping of women and the enslaving of children continues, as does Daesh's killing spree and forced conversion of members of religious minorities. There are now more than 20,000 terrorist foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq, including around 120 Australians. Australian extremists have been exploited by Daesh for propaganda and recruitment purposes, but are now also linked to planning terrorist plots in Australia. Reports that Australian foreign fighters are serving with Daesh's English-speaking unit, the so-called Anwar al-Awlaki Brigade, to orchestrate attacks on home soil are deeply disturbing. And, Mr Speaker, we make no mistake about this. This conflict poses a direct threat to Australia and its people. The Syrian government itself has perpetrated awful attacks against its own citizens overnight. Regime airstrikes against a market outside Damascus reportedly killed over 80 Syrian civilians. This is militarily, politically and strategically a complex theatre of war, and it is important that Australia presents a united front for these terrorist organisations, otherwise they will exploit any divisions within Australia. And that is why I was shocked to learn that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition has broken ranks and is now attacking government policy on the fight against terrorism. In fact, she's had a go at the Leader of the Opposition on the way through.
Members on my right will cease interjecting. The member for Ballarat is warned. The member for McMahon. The member for McMahon. Members on my left will cease interjecting.
The member for Sydney wants Australia's Defence Forces to cease the airstrikes against Daesh, and she wants our fighter jets to drop food hampers over Syria. And guess who'll end up feasting on them? A terrorist
Members on my
picnic.
right.
Now, I know the Deputy Leader of the Opposition struggles with geography. She has said more than once that Africa
The Minister
is
will
a
resume
country.
her seat. The Minister will resume her seat. The member for Watson on a point of order. Those props are out of order. And the clerks will collect them.
Natasha.
I'm not hearing the member for Watson until interjections cease. The member for Kingston will cease interjecting. The member for Throsby will decide when the member for Watson gets the call. The member for Herbert is warned. The member for Herbert will remove himself under 94A. Are you up? Member for Watson. I call the minister.
Now, I know the Deputy Leader of
Members
the
on my
Opposition
right will
struggles with
cease
geography.
the chatter.
She said more than once that Africa is a country. It's not. Now she has claimed that Syria is about the same size as Australia. Australia is 42 times larger than Syria. Now, if the Deputy Leader of the Opposition can't get basic facts right, if she thinks
the minister will resume her seat. A point of order.
For the leadership jostling on the front bench of the government. But
The
it is
member
not
for
relevant to the
Gellibrand.
question
There's
that
no
was
point
asked
of
to the
order.
minister.
The member for Gellibrand will remove himself under 94A. It's a complete abuse of the standing orders. I call the minister. The Treasurer will cease
If
interjecting.
the Deputy Leader of the Opposition thinks
Member
that
for Kingston
Daesh
is
can be
warned.
defeated by food, not force, let's hope that she never has anything to do with the planning of strategy
The
in this
minister will
country.
resume her seat. Her time has expired. The member for Kennedy, who missed his call earlier, has the call now. Member for Kennedy, your time starts now.
To the Minister for Trade, Andrew Forrest said West Australian government refusal to build a key rail corridor set West Australia mining back 23 years. Every inch of rail coal line in Queensland was built by government. Whilst applauding the government on environmental issues in the Galilee, the government can build this rail line tomorrow. The real problem, a failure by Adani to raise capital, was the same problem as with Reinhardt and Palmer. Build it tomorrow, Minister.
The acting leader of the House, I think
Mr.
I can
Speaker,
anticipate the point of order.
With great
Member for
respect
Kennedy,
to the
resume
member
his
for-
seat. His time's expired.
Member for Kennedy, he doesn't seem to understand the difference between a statement and a question. There was no question.
There was no question. There was a 30-second statement. No, I'm going to member for Kennedy. Will the member for Kennedy resume his seat? Member for Kennedy. I'll call the member for Watson.
It has been a challenge in this House for decades that ministers have to answer questions from the member for Kennedy, and they have often been framed in a unique way. But for heaven's sake, let the minister stand up and answer the question.
Yes,
Mr. Speaker.
The acting leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Kennedy has been in this place longer than most people have been here. If he hasn't learnt the standing orders by now, then he should suffer the consequences.
I call the member for Braddon.
Thank you. Thank you.
I call the member for Braddon. You
Thank
can't
you.
call a point of order. I've called the next question.
Thank you,
Member for Kennedy,
Speaker.
resume his seat.
Thank you, Speaker, very much. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, who's representing the Minister for Employment today. What action is the government taking to ensure fair workplaces and support for honest union leaders, and what obstacles may be standing in the way?
I call the Minister for Foreign Affairs representing the Minister for Employment. The Minister
thank you,
has
Mr.
the call.
Speaker, and I thank the member for Braddon for his question and his support.
Member for Hunter won't interject when he's been complaining about interjections. The Minister.
I thank the member for Braddon for his question, and I appreciate the support that he's giving to the coalition government for our commitment to ensuring that fair workplaces exist in this country and that there's a union movement where officials put the interests of the workers ahead of their self-interest. That's why the coalition have reforms to establish a registered organisation commission, why we are seeking to re-establish the Australian Building and Construction Commission to protect workers and honest union members, and it's why we established a Royal Commission to ensure that dodgy union bosses like Craig Thompson and Michael Williamson and Bruce Wilson are not allowed to keep siphoning off the money of the honest union members whom they were meant to represent.
I remind the member for Melbourne
and by
Ports he's
opposing our
warned.
reforms, the Labor Party is representing the interests of dodgy union bosses rather than the union members those bosses are meant to represent. Now, the mock outrage of the Labor Party frontbenchers as they seek to smear the name of a former High Court judge shows how desperate they are to protect themselves, not just the union bosses,
Member for Chisholm.
to protect themselves and their union masters in an outrageous attempt to throw mud at a Royal Commissioner. Now, you have to ask yourself, what does the Labor Party have to hide? Well, it's already been reported that a former AWU secretary, aka the Leader of the Opposition, traded away the penalty rates of low-paid workers. It's been reported that the AWU received hundreds of thousands of dollars in unexplained payments, that the Leader of the Opposition failed to disclose over $40,000 donated to his political campaign by a company with which his union was dealing until just before he was called before the Royal Commission. So we know that criminal charges have been recommended against at least 3 of the most senior officials of the militant construction union, the CFMEU. No less than 4 officials have been arrested as the result of matters before the Royal Commission, and a series of unions have been implicated in secret slush fund scandals that have finally come to light.
Cease interjecting.
So why is the Labor
Member
Party
for
so
Gorton.
eager to hide this evidence? Well, here are 3 reasons. First, union masters have provided Labor members with $46 million since 2007. They wouldn't be here
Member
without
for
them.
Chifley.
2, the Leader of the Opposition is facing very serious questions about his time as a union leader. 3, Labor members are being directed by their union masters by standing against reforms that would clean up the activities of dishonest union bosses, and these people will stand to lose millions if the Royal
Minister's
Commission
time
goes
has
ahead.
expired. I call Member for Deakin will cease interjecting. He's already been warned. Member for Throsby is again interrupting the member for Watson. The member for Watson has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Attorney-General. In question time on Thursday, after being asked specifically about when the Attorney or his office was first aware that Dyson Heydon had agreed to be keynote speaker at a Liberal Party event, the Minister answered by referring to that there had been contact that morning. Given that it emerged on the weekend that the Attorney-General's office received notice on the 11th of April, why has the Minister failed yet again to come into this House to correct the record at the first available opportunity?
Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Minister has the call.
Thank you. And I thank the member for his question. The answer I gave last Thursday was in direct, relevant response to the question. I am advised the Attorney-General first heard about this through the media. He telephoned the Commissioner about 11:30 this morning. The Commissioner advised he'd already confirmed he will not be attending the Sir Garfield Barwick address. Fact. Secondly,
Members on my left. Members on my left will cease interjecting. Members on my left will cease interjecting if they want to hear the answer. The Minister has the call.
the Attorney-General's electorate office received
Member
a
for Chifley will remove himself under
notice
94A.
on the 11th of April.
Multiple times.
The Attorney-General already had a prior standing committee in Canberra on the day of the event, so his staff automatically declined and apologised in his behalf. The Attorney-General did not see the save-the-date notice.
I call the member for Ford. The member for Isaacs will cease interjecting.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the minister outline the importance of the 457 visa program and why it is important that its integrity is maintained?
I call the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member very much for his question. Australia, of course, was built on migration, and the 457 program is important because it allows employers to fill skilled labour shortages where local workers can't be found. Mr Speaker, skilled overseas workers through the 457 visa program form an integral part of the economic machinery that creates Australian jobs by preventing skill shortages that limit the growth of our economy. The revelation that multiple trade unions have employed 457 visa holders is an act of incredible hypocrisy and duplicity, given the long-term campaign the union movement has waged against the 457 program and now against the free trade agreement with China. So I went to have a look at the transcript of the ad, which is running on television sets at the moment, trying to scare people into believing that the free trade agreement is not good for this country. And I had a look at the original transcript of this ad, and I think members might be interested in the original transcript. It went something like this. Of course, there's a union boss within this ad, this scare campaign ad, and the father's sitting there with the son, and the father says, "I can't believe they've done it." The son says, "Done what?" Dad says, "The job I lined up for you at the union. It's been filled by a foreign worker." But Dad, the union's running a scare campaign against foreign workers. Dad says, "Believe it or not, son, the union's employed 41 457 workers, and the most frequently sponsored worker was the workplace relations advisor." Now, the irony, of course, Mr Speaker, is that we've seen the member for Gorton today get up here and try and trash the reputation of an honourable man. He's got up here, he's failed to declare his own interest in this matter because, as it turns out, this ad was authorised by M O'Connor, your brother. Who's he? He's the head of the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union, who owns and operates most of these people opposite.
Minister will resume his seat. Has the minister concluded his answer? Members on my right will cease interjecting. Member for Watson will cease interjecting. The member for Watson will cease interjecting. Member for Hotham will resume hers. Those on my right will see. The member for Corangamite is warned. The member for Watson on a point of order. The minister's concluded his answer.
No, I know the minister's concluded his answer, but in terms of your management of the House, Mr Speaker, I just asked
Members on my right will cease interjecting.
I just want to raise, and I think the Prime Minister of all people wants this parliament to maintain the rule that we do not bring family members into debate.
Okay, well, that's not a point of order, but members on my right will cease interjecting. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. The Minister for Immigration will cease interjecting. Member for Watson will cease interjecting. That wasn't a point of order, that was a statement. I've asked the Treasurer to stop interjecting. I call the member for Gorton. The member for Lingiari will cease interjecting.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last year, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "You appoint someone of Dyson Heydon's standing because you trust his judgment, and I'm very happy to put ourselves in the hands of Dyson Heydon and see where this commission goes." Isn't your continued trust based on your long-standing relationship with Mr Heydon and the fact that a partisan inquiry is exactly what you wanted?
The member for Solomon is warned. I call the Prime Minister.
I'm sorry, what was that?
The member for Rankin will remove himself under 94A. He should. Actually, the member for Rankin can withdraw first before we go. No. The member for Watson will resume his seat. The member for Rankin has been on multiple warnings for interjecting. Member for Watson, you've been asked to leave under 94A.
The member for Rankin has just been excluded for answering a question that the Prime Minister put from the dispatch box.
No, he's been excluded.
That was his interjection. The Prime Minister said, "I beg your pardon." He responded, and then you punted him for it.
No, the member for Watson will resume his seat. Those on my right will cease interjecting. The member for Watson well knows that I have warned the member for Rankin multiple times, so he can pick the standing order under which he was ejected. Disorderly conduct was the first thing that came into my mind. Now, he's left the chamber. He was warned twice. I've bent over backwards. I will not put up with members interjecting continuously, particularly when they've been warned. I call the Prime Minister.
Well, it's not surprising, Mr Speaker, that the Shadow Attorney-General has dropped out of the attack and that the member for Gorton has now been asked to continue the attack because the member for Gorton, I suppose, is less familiar than the Shadow Attorney-General with the appropriate conduct when there is some issue with the presiding officer of a tribunal or a Royal Commission. For the benefit of the member for Gorton, who probably wasn't listening to my response to the Shadow Attorney-General, let me quote this statement from Mr Duncan McConnell, the President of the Law Council of Australia, who says, and I quote, "The public attacks on the Commissioner being played out through the media are unacceptable and damage the basis on which tribunals and courts operate." He goes on to say, "The person who sits as a Royal Commissioner is entitled to the same respect inside and outside the inquiry as a judge in a court. In this case, Mr John Dyson Heydon, AC QC, is a highly regarded former judicial officer. The proper way for dealing with any question of bias, including apprehended bias, is to make an application for the Commissioner to recuse himself." Now, I say to the member for Gorton, the Shadow Minister who asked the question, if he, his political allies, his friends have any issue whatsoever with Royal Commissioner Dyson Heydon ACQC, they know what to do, and why don't they do it? If they think there's a problem, they should bring an application. What are they waiting for? What are the unions waiting for? Perhaps they know that the professionalism and the impartiality of this former High Court judge is absolutely beyond dispute. Perhaps they know that it is not a very good look to be trying to cover up the cover-up which so many members opposite have been engaged in for so many years. What we have seen again and again and again before this Royal Commission are rorts, rackets and rip-offs perpetrated by union officials against union members. It's wrong. It must stop. And I suspect even the ACTU is starting to feel a little bit of shame. And I think that shame would be appropriate amongst members opposite as well.
I call the member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Small Business. Will the minister update the House on how the government is supporting small business to create jobs? And are there any threats to the government's approach in this matter?
I call the Minister for Small Business.
Thanks, Speaker, and thanks to the member for Gilmore. She's a great representative for her community and the 9,000 small businesses that are a part of it. This morning I was listening to ABC News Radio and I heard a headline that said, "Stronger than expected jobs growth, big boost for the economy." And I thought, at last, the mainstream media will pick up some factual economic information and they'll underline the fundamental strength in the Australian economy. Alas, it went on to talk about the United States. And I thought that was a little bit curious because Australia's actually got stronger jobs growth than the United States, than Canada, than the UK, than in fact any of the G7 economies. But you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know from the rabble and the racket coming from those opposite. The story of jobs growth in the Australian economy under the Abbott government is very, very positive. And it should be that way, and it should be recognised as such. We've seen more than 330,000 jobs created in the economy since the election of the Abbott government. And what we've seen is the good news continues, the strongest level of female participation rate in the workforce. This is great news. Small business formation at record levels, led primarily by women. We've got record company registration. Bankruptcies have fallen to the lowest level in 20 years. Business entries are up, exits are down. This is a really positive story about jobs and growth. And what a surprise I don't want to hear about it.
The member for Throsby on a point of order.
Point of order, Speaker. It's relevance. For the minister to be relevant, he has to refer to the 9% unemployment in the member for Gilmore's electorate.
The member for Throsby, that is disorderly conduct. The member for Throsby will remove himself under 94A. I will not put up with frivolous points of order. I call the minister.
A bit of union strong-arming going on over there. And this has been achieved by getting out of the road of job creators. We've been reducing red tape, removing harmful anti-jobs, anti-growth taxes like the carbon tax, getting the policy settings right to support enterprising men and women, to start to grow their businesses, to succeed, to employ more Australians, opening up new markets. The free trade agreement, incredibly important. Hundreds of millions of new prospective customers ready for Australian businesses to delight them and to see our economy and jobs grow. This is the story. This is what the member for Gilmore knows and can share with her community. And we're seeing confidence figures coming through strongly. The National Australia Bank SME quarterly survey showing business confidence and conditions are up. Even today, the Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Survey, again showing a steady lift despite international volatility. And all the leader opposite can talk about is politics. That's where you go wrong, sunshine. This is about jobs and growth. Now, what places that at risk? That's where you get it wrong, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. No, it's been covered.
There's no sunshine there.
No, it's been covered. The minister will continue. Members on my right will cease interjecting.
And that fantastic, I suppose, Australian leading small business package. What a great difference that's made. World class, admired by many, and even Labor tries to associate itself with it. Well, what puts all this at risk? Labor's plan to once again clobber small businesses with a carbon tax on steroids. What is also Labor putting at risk? Access to new markets through the FTAs, through your complicity, through a shabby, misleading and dishonest campaign. We're opening the door for business and we're winning that business.
I call the Prime Minister.
Further questions be placed on the
That was a question that was given.